Welcome everyone to this panel on tools for unlocking investment in climate solutions. My name is Santiago Enriquez, and I am a senior climate change specialist at Abt Associates. It is really a pleasure to be moderating this panel today. Next, please. Let me share with you our agenda for today's event. It's a relatively straightforward agenda. First, I'll provide some overview to start framing our discussions. And then after that overview, we'll have 4 stellar panelists. We'll begin with Abt Mills, who will be talking about partnering with the private sector through a global development alliance, focusing on an example from building resilience in Jamaica's energy sector. Then we'll have one virtual speaker, Michelle Laird, who will be talking about green bonds as a mechanism to support climate investment, including some relevant experience in Peru. After that, our third speaker, Alan Miller, will talk about the sustainable cooling facility and the challenge of designing adaptation tools, including some really interesting examples from a facility that is working with 9 countries. And our fourth speaker, Ben Matek, here participating live in this event, will talk about using cost-benefit analysis to inform climate actions, including some examples from Ghana and the United States. Next slide, please. So to get our discussion started, we all know that climate finance is a central issue here at COP26. One of the key issues that is being negotiated is how developed countries can meet their commitments to mobilize at least $100 billion annually by 2020 and through 2050 to address the needs of developing countries. But we also now know that even achieving this goal would be insufficient to achieve a net zero target. For instance, as the graph on the right here shows, the International Energy Agency estimates that in order to achieve net zero emissions in the energy sector alone, investments would need to increase from about 1.2 trillion currently to about 4.4 trillion by 2030 and 4.1 trillion by 2050. So clearly there's a financial gap, and it's also very important to be able to engage the private sector to close that gap. Next slide, please. And in addition to securing additional finance for climate action, we also need to make sure that available resources are used wisely. And what this means is that there's an urgent need to address barriers in accessing climate finance, for example, by improving the enabling environment and make sure it's conducive for those climate investments. And there's also a need to build in-country capacity by multiple stakeholders to develop bankable projects. It's clearly important to increase finance for adaptation, ensuring that there is a balance between finance for adaptation and mitigation. And it's also very important to improve the effectiveness of private finance being mobilized. This might mean things, for instance, like developing overall strategies for mobilizing private sector finance, but also supporting new financial instruments to mobilize the private sector. Next slide, please. And as these negotiations continue at COP26, we must also start finding answers to questions such as how can we mobilize resources that are already available? How can we crowd in the private sector? And how can we make sure that we are using available resources wisely? So recognizing that climate action should not be delayed, today's panel will focus on tools that are readily available and that can help provide examples that can also answer these questions. So without further ado, let me hand it over to our participants. I will ask each of you to first introduce yourselves briefly, and then we'll move on to the presentations. So first, Abt, please.
So good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Glasgow to all the people that are here in the room with us and watching us online. My name is Abt Mills. I am consulting for the Cadmos Group, and thank you to Abt for sharing this space with the Cadmos Group. The Cadmos Group is an highly specialized environmental and energy international consultancy firm based in the United States. And I have the pleasure to serve as the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance Chair. The Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance Chair, as you will hear later on, is a conglomerate of private sector businesses that have been put together under the GDA USAID financing program, 3-year program, is strengthening energy resilience in Jamaica. So I'll tell you more about it in a bit.
Thank you, Anette.
Thank you for having me.
Let me go over to our virtual participants. First, I would like Michelle Laird, who is joining us virtually, to introduce herself. And after that, we'll ask Alan Miller, who's joining us from the Washington area, to introduce himself. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, I can hear you, Santiago. Yes.
Excellent.
I apologize. I've missed all of the intro, but I'll introduce myself. I'm Michelle Laird. I'm with Abt Associates. I'm a regional vice president at Abt Associates. And I entered the field of development from investment banking back I was in investment banking in the 1990s and then joined Abt Associates. And my focus has really been on mobilizing public and private sector finance since then into sustainable development goals. In 2008, I began working in climate change. And I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about different ways we can mobilize finance into climate action, mitigation, adaptation, and other forms of climate action. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's see if we can connect with Alan Miller. Alan, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you well. And I'll just add then my own brief introduction. I've been working on global environmental issues since starting with ozone depletion in the late 70s, which means I'm old. And I've been working on climate finance issues since I started with the Global Environment Facility back in the early 90s. And I'm going to speak specifically about a project that I helped the World Bank prepare on sustainable cooling, which was just recently approved by the Green Climate Fund a few weeks ago. And I think indicates many of the challenges, but also some of the evolving solutions to finance for adaptation.
Thank you, Alan. And coming back to Glasgow, Ben.
Thanks for having me. My name is Benjamin Matek. I work with Santiago at Abt Associates, and I have my experiences that I'm an environmental economist, and I have several thousands of hours of experience doing cost-benefit analysis for many government clients, including USAID, Department of Transportation, US EPA, OSHA, and others.
Thanks, Ben. So I think now we're ready for the presentations. Anate, are you ready?
I'm very ready. I think we have very important questions here on the screen, and I'm hoping that with the presentations we can start dissecting a little bit the answers that I think we all have. If we can move to the next slide, I'm hoping to start seeing yes. So as I was telling you before, CADMOS has been selected, let's say, awarded by USAID to implement this Global Development Alliance program. And I'm obviously not representing USAID, but CADMOS is honored to be collaborating with USAID for quite some years. So let me tell you very quickly what the Global Development Alliance is. A GDA is a partnership where USAID and the private sector work together to develop and implement innovative business models that catalyze markets to solve development challenge at scale, which is something that is very important for developing countries, especially when you're talking about adaptation and mitigation. So this is done through 3 approaches: market-based approaches, and shared responsibility and co-creation. So this is definitely not working in silos, but on the contrary, leveraging the experience of development partners like USAID and the experience of the private sector and the local markets, as well as other experts. And obviously mobilizing, and we hear a lot the word mobilizing, private sector contributions, which is absolutely the key to this. We have to crowd in the private sector and give them and create the spaces in which the private sector feels encouraged and empowered and part of the process of investing in adaptation. So this market-based approach has created what we call the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance. And I'll tell you a little bit more as we move to the next slide. So the Strengthening Energy Sector Resilience in Jamaica, that's the formal program name. And the context is the Jamaica mission of the USAID has awarded $4 million to an alliance of Jamaican and international organizations to strengthen the resilience of Jamaica's energy sector. So what does that mean? Strengthen the ability of Jamaica's energy sector to withstand and rebound quickly from a natural or human-made shock by supporting the adoption of distributed and resilient renewable energies and technologies. And that's something that Jamaica, as you all see, is an island that is blessed with solar almost all year, if not all year, and it's one of the mitigation targets. The NDC, the National Determined Contribution in Jamaica, the climate plan, is underpinned in the energy sector and the forestry sectors. The alliance itself includes solar energy developers that have put up to 50 million US dollars in investment funds to support solar project implementation to build resilient distributed energy for Jamaica businesses and industries. Obviously, when you are as a capital investor, I think it's important that now that we are talking about COP and what do we expect as outcomes from COP, we really need to start pushing the narrative that this is not something that sectors, private sector, public sector should be doing alone. And the more we create the partnerships, the better. So as we move to the next slide, let me quickly walk you through what's the challenge in Jamaica and invite you to come to Jamaica at some point and understand a little bit about the context. But the challenges in Jamaica is that there's limited access to financing, especially for mitigation for the increase of renewable energy. With the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance and these private sector developers that I'll tell you more about in a bit, have put up this capital for qualified projects. And I'll tell you more about what qualified projects mean. There's limited knowledge or awareness of solar energy. We have found different feedback. We have obtained different feedback from customers about limited knowledge about the intricacies of navigating the permitting process for solar. So the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance offers informational resources and events for businesses to make well-informed decisions on investment in clean energy. There's confusing sales and installation processes, I was mentioning. So we're working to demystify the sales and installation process. And there's obviously high upfront costs. And so the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance offers third-party ownership to bring down upfront costs and allow customers to pay for systems over time. We have found that customers that are interested in solar energy sometimes do not know that there's other avenues for uptaking renewable energy by leasing, for example, or instead of going for upfront credits or loans. Next slide. So I'm very excited about sharing a little bit about our partners. This is the Alliance, includes private sector partners, 2 teams of solar developers that have, as I mentioned, put up this capital to invest in eligible distributed PV and PV storage projects. Also involves Jamaica's leading consumer goods and pharmaceutical distribution company. So WRB Energy is a very well-known developer based in Florida. Wigton Wind Farm is our Jamaica's wind farm and largest wind farm in the Caribbean. They're stepping into the wind energy into solar and already amassing good experience. Surgy Energy is a Jamaican company based in Toronto, specialized in storage, in energy storage. And Lasco, which I mentioned, is a leading food distribution company in Jamaica. We have other private sector partners. As we move to the next slide, we have knowledge partners as well. We cannot do and generate the type of solutions that we're looking to generate without bringing in the academia and the national experts. So the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance has also established partnerships with the University of the West Indies based in Jamaica. Global Solutions International, a private sector international firm that offers certified NAPCEP training programs, and RMI, which I hope many of you may know or may not know, but it's a very well-known think tank in Colorado. And we have more partners. As we move to the next slide, we talked about the market, what I would call the market expert partners, which includes the Jamaica Hotel Tourist Association and ourselves, the CADMOS Group, as the implementers, serving as the implementers of this program, but also bringing many, many years of experience in the sector. Moving on to the next slide. So our activities, very quickly, we're conducting a little bit of regulatory review of the space and the installation process for solar energy in Jamaica. We are piloting in a large commercial facility with LASCO, a PV photovoltaics system with storage that will also generate electricity for a community center next door to the distribution center. Very important for shelter when a disaster hits. We are developing workforce development programs. As I mentioned, NAPCEP certified training programs are being delivered through the Jamaica Energy Resilience Alliance. We are identifying customers and investment opportunities for our partners. Of course, $50 million are surprisingly easy and not so easy to allocate. And I'll tell you more about it. And we're creating a space in which the public and the private sector can interact and create more solutions for disaster resilience, which is very important for the GDA and USAID and in Jamaica in general. Moving on to the next slide. I think I'm gonna move very quickly through the next slides, but the regulatory review, as I was mentioning, we're looking specifically into what we call the soft costs. What does it mean, or how much does it mean for a Jamaican business operator to go through the hoops and all the process of installation, and how much does that cost? The application process, the installation, permitting, how long does it take? Because all of that can be translated into money and important investment from business operators. We're looking into generate some recommendations on how to streamline the process, make it faster for local installers, and generate some soft cost savings. And we're looking very, very deeply into the factors that inhibit the use of distributed renewable energy in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. Next slide. The pilot program or project that I was mentioning before with LASCO is going to also serve as a research facility on battery life and optimal operation. There's a lot of local energy professionals that have a lot of interest in understanding how storage for energy works, what kind of savings can bring into commercial facilities, which is very important to improve and encourage more uptake of solar energy in the manufacturing and industry sector. We're looking very strongly into how we're targeting the hotel sector. Obviously, Jamaica has a lot of many hotels. Obviously, is a leading destination. But also there's manufacturing, there's commercial facilities, there's a very strong SME sector that wants to access solar energy. And the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the workforce development. We're conducting training for solar and solar storage installation, system inspection, providing certifications that usually, require a lot of investment. We have already trained 59 people I have not do it myself, but with our partners, with JSI and the University of the West Indies, we're making this possible, and Wicton as well. And next slide. The most important part, which is the part about mobilizing and crowding in the private sector. We're conducting pre-identification of businesses that are interested in leasing agreements to deploy the solar energy technologies, collaborating with local associations, which is very important, and CADMOS in our role as implementers. We're developing and have already deployed an outreach and awareness campaign for Jamaican businesses. As I wrap up, if I'm not mistaken, I should be getting closer to the next to the last slide. So the progress to date, we have extensive market analysis into Jamaica's hotel and manufacturing sectors and customer awareness. We have pre-identified a pipeline of investments in PV and PV storage within the hotel sector, and we're moving into manufacturing and industry and SMEs. We have developed an outreach and awareness campaign to start generating more information for local businesses. We have deployed very specialized technical surveys to understand the permitting and assess the permitting process, creating a pool of local installers so we can do business referrals and create more business opportunities for local energy professionals, and have delivered certified training programs. I'm going to stop right there, as I know my colleagues probably in the panel would like to share more, but let me stop there.
Thank you, Anity. Yeah, and we'll have time to get into more details soon.
Sure.
But GDA is certainly a very interesting example of how to mobilize investments. USAID provided 4 million, and you were able to mobilize 50 million from private sector. And that's one interesting mechanism, right? But there's others. And so now Michelle Laird, who's again joining us virtually, will talk about green bonds and how that is an additional mechanism that countries might use to leverage private sector and also development funds. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, thanks very much. Could we move to the next slides? Next. Here we go, green bonds. So green bonds are one mechanism to support climate investment. And we just heard about GDAs, which uses government money to really draw in private sector investment as well to really advance climate change. What I'm going to talk about today is green bonds as another mechanism. And really green bonds, for those of you that are familiar with financial markets, they're really like other bonds. They're like plain vanilla bonds, but they have an added benefit, which is that the use of proceeds are really focused on environmental considerations. A subsector of green bonds is climate bonds, and those have additional criteria to ensure that investment is going into either climate mitigation or climate adaptation types of activities. Santiago, you touched on a few questions earlier, and I jotted them down. How can we mobilize resources that are already available? That is funding, investment that's there but wants a place to go, for example. How can we crowd in the private sector? How can we enable markets to really draw in, again, that private investment? And how can we make sure that we're using available resources wisely? I'd say that green bonds can do all of that, climate bonds can do all of that. And one of the reasons that it can mobilize resources that are already available is it provides an instrument that matches well for the investors. For example, if you look at various institutional investors like pension funds or institutional investors or insurance companies, for example, that want long-term money investment, a bond is a good investment for them. And then meanwhile, if you have projects like renewable energy projects like we were just discussing, that might want funding really across a long-term project cycle, again, a long-term mechanism is good for them. So it provides, a green bond can provide funding across project cycle, it's long-term debt, so it can address the asset liability mismatch, the mismatch between timing of some instruments. it can be low cost in terms of, it can be like any other bond on the market and low cost, but priority area, again, is for green investments. It also, it just offers an alternate market for investors to put their money where they want to. And that's, I'm going to move to the next slide and talk about a project that Abt Associates was involved in. Actually, on the overall project, CEDAR, the Climate Economic Analysis for Development, Investment, and Resilience, that's where I met Alan Miller. So I'm really pleased for us to join up here again. Within that project, we worked in Peru on assessing the market for green bonds. What we were first looking at there actually was whether municipalities could issue green bonds to draw in private sector investment there. At that time, though, the municipalities were not really at the stage, they weren't really creditworthy yet to do that. And so there was too much risk for the investors. But we did also look at the national development banks. And we looked at renewable energy projects, but then we also got involved with Agrobanco, which was a national development bank really focused more on sustainable landscapes, on forestry, on environment. And together with them, we looked at the options for a green bond. What was really exciting here is this is a type of national, we talk a lot about renewable energy, but in this case, it was seeing how there could be climate-friendly agriculture and forestry, and how could there be increased financing for that. So we developed a green bond roadmap for them. How we did that was we actually went out into the local market to see what investors wanted. What was very different at this time was a lot of the green bonds that were being issued back when we first were looking at this were more drawing in international finance and they were in international currencies, not in local currencies. We were trying to see if it would work to have a local bond in local currency drawing from local investors. We learned that indeed the pension funds and insurance companies really wanted a long-term investment that matched their currency. And so this was perfect. We developed this roadmap to really show the different steps that one needed to take. And again, they're the types of steps that you would take to issue any bond, but there were indeed extras. There needed to be a system in place, and you asked about using the money wisely. How do you monitor the investment? How do you make sure it's going where it needs to go? And also, what is the impact? So we looked at Climate Bonds Initiative, which has been putting together over many years. I think they began in 2011. They've been putting together criteria and standards for climate bonds. And that's what's really important, is to ensure that it's not just named green bond, but actually that the money has criteria, that there are criteria for the projects that are being invested in. And so it's extra work for an issuer to be certified to issue a climate bond, because they do need to ensure that they're meeting these criteria, and then also that they're monitoring afterwards. And so included in this roadmap, and this is actually public, this roadmap is public, it's up on, somebody's gonna have to help me on what the DEC, what that acronym stands for, but it is, well, we can, Alan's laughing. Maybe he'll let me know in the next in his talk. But we can definitely provide that information later, and people can go look at the roadmap and look at all of the different steps that are there. Next slide, please. So in the roadmap, we were looking at pre-issuance issues, issuance issues, and post-issuance. So again, the things that one needed to do in each stage. When we looked at Agrobanco, one of the things that they were interested in was really using their whole balance sheet to secure their bond. And there are different ways to do green bonds. Their use of proceeds green bonds, which is what this was going to be. And the recourse is really to the issuer there. So the same credit rating for the issuer is given to the bond. Their use of proceeds green revenue bonds, where they're earmarked for green projects that that can provide revenue, and then you're tapping into that revenue stream. They're green project bonds, they're green asset-backed securities, and they're green covered bonds. And all of this is covered in the report. I know my time is short, so I'll go to the next slide. So what are the trends that are supporting expansion of green bonds? I think this is an interesting area. Since we began working in green bonds, I think that investors are much more keen to be responsible in where their money goes. I think they really are seeking, if they're going to invest and they have an option to do, to invest wisely, then a bond that has met criteria that show that it's climate-friendly investment is going to draw more resources. So really labeling opportunities is helpful. Having standards like the Climate Bonds Initiative for their climate bonds is really important because, again, investors can look at different sectors. They can go online and see what those criteria are and see if that matches what their goals or their mandates are. There are third-party reviews now for these types of bonds to ensure that they are meeting those criteria before and after issuance, which is really important. National development banks, in terms of issuers, national development banks around the world are starting to issue green bonds. Yieldcos, which are publicly traded companies formed to own operating assets that produce a predictable cash flow, they were in favor, then they were out of favor, and actually post-pandemic, they've come back into favor again, often used for renewable energy. They also are a possible issuer for green bonds. Various countries around the world that are developing countries have been issuing them. And again, I mentioned some of these instruments before. There are different types of instruments. Green bonds can be, they can pool small projects. They can securitize climate-related loans. They can be convertible bonds. So I realize that during the less than 8 minutes, I think that I've been speaking, I've only touched on a few issues. And I hope that during our discussion later, we can talk more about how this is a mechanism to really drive investment wisely into climate action. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michelle. So DEX stands for Development Experience Clearinghouse. I know everyone in the audience knew that, but just in case, the report is available there and also in Climate Links. And thank you, Michelle. I think this is a great opportunity to show or showcase an instrument that targeted investments in the natural, sort of natural-based solutions to climate change. We have also, with an idea we first discussed about an interesting program that included energy and resilience, jointly. And now we're going to go to the Washington area with Alan Miller, where he's going to be talking more specifically about projects to finance adaptation. So, Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Santiago, and great seeing you again, Michelle. My slides, please. So I'm going to focus primarily on a recently approved project, which, while approved, I will just say, given the procedures of the Green Climate Fund, it may still be some time before it's actually dispersed and implemented. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I actually started with climate finance back in the early 90s when the first dedicated financial mechanism, the Global Environment Facility, was initially created, first as a pilot project in 1991, and then made permanent by instrument in 1994. And at that time, there was very little focus on adaptation, although we did a lot of early projects that set some of the basis for projects like the one in Jamaica. We did a lot of early renewable energy in the 90s, and there was a big difference in the politics surrounding mitigation, projects like renewables and energy efficiency versus adaptation. The donors at the time were very concerned that adaptation was too ill-defined, that it was just, as some would say, good development. And consequently, they couldn't figure out what was then a key principle that we don't talk about very much, which was incremental cost. This was something that came out of the Montreal Protocol and the issue of ozone depletion and the introduction of substitutes for ozone depleting chemicals with a higher cost. That was a concept that fit pretty well with renewable energy. It was the differential between fossil fuels and, at the time, much higher cost renewable energy. This is on this slide a list of a number of what were really seen as we thought about it, and to this day really continue to persist as challenges to meeting the increasing demand, which we're hearing in COP26, that more and more of the climate funds need to go to adaptation, and to the more than 150 countries really who have been responsible for hardly any greenhouse gas emissions, but many of whom are highly vulnerable and are experiencing climate disasters virtually as we speak. So just to touch on a couple of them, one is to contrast renewable energy as a good example. You have a specific sector. You have a lot of complexities, as we heard, about consumers, about public policy, about technical issues in project design. But in contrast, if you take an issue like cooling, which is a source of is an essential need for both mitigation and adaptation, with extreme temperatures and food waste, food loss, fisheries loss due to the absence of cold chain, you're cutting across all kinds of issues, right? You're dealing with agriculture, you're dealing with buildings, of course, in the design to minimize the cooling, mechanical cooling requirements. You're dealing with infrastructure, for example, large water infrastructure and the need to address both droughts and intense rainfall. And most recently, of course, with COVID, we've seen a big set of issues around human health with the need for cooling for vaccines. And each of these is a distinct set of issues that in almost every case are very much country specific. In contrast with what Michelle very effectively described around the investor incentives, in many cases, with adaptation, we're talking about projects which may primarily, apropos our economist Santiago, be public goods. They may not generate commercial returns, and consequently, they're much more difficult to frame projects like green bonds, although, as Michelle can probably address, there are resilience bonds that I've been hearing about more recently. There also is the reality that, of course, what are you adapting to and over what period of time is largely dependent on whether we keep temperature extremes below 2 degrees or ideally 1.5, or do we go closer to 3 degrees? What is the goal that we are designing the project to meet? So finally, and this introduces the project I'll talk about in a little detail, you're often dealing with small components of larger investments. So for example, changes in hydro projects to allow for drought and increased rainfall, where you might decide you're actually in need of a larger reservoir. Or you might find that because of the installation in solar and wind, the backup power from hydro is worth more than you originally anticipated, and consequently, you may want to increase the size. So all of these are challenging design issues that go to the difficulty of designing projects that can, as we've been hearing about, leverage private investment more effectively. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about a project that I helped design for some time. I didn't mention in the introduction, I actually worked in the World Bank Group for 16 years, retired from the International Finance Corporation going on 7 years ago, which is, of course, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. A few years ago, the bank started to get interested in the challenge of cooling. There were reports, for example, from both Sustainable Energy for All, which has a pavilion, I think, here in Glasgow, and the International Energy Agency called The Future of Cooling, both pointing out, if you don't deal with cooling, forget the 2 degrees, because air conditioning alone, if it's powered by fossil fuels, will exceed all the renewable energy. And in fact, within the last few years, cooling demand has grown faster than solar and wind additions, which was such a stunning fact that I had to look it up myself. It seemed incredible, but it's true. So The World Bank actually has done two things. One is a roadmap. So we've just heard the importance of roadmaps and what they can achieve in Michelle's presentation. The World Bank just 2 weeks ago published a roadmap for sustainable cooling for the next few decades, which I was proud to have worked on. And in addition, they prepared an example of what I think was an interesting indication of the value that a multilateral development bank like the World Bank can have in addressing multi-sector projects which require building on the base of sector lending in agriculture, in health, etc. So as I said, several years ago, the bank began working on it, and it was finally given the very lengthy and complex process of the Green Climate Fund, just approved in the last GCF meeting in early October. The project involves funding for 9 countries, 4 of which are least developed countries: Bangladesh, Malawi, Sao Tome and Principe, and Somalia. This responds to one of the increasing criticisms of climate finance, which is the challenge in helping the poorest and most vulnerable countries. Secondly, and this again goes to the point about the multi-sector nature of adaptation, they needed to find a way to deal with buildings, health, agriculture, etc. And the way the bank went about this was to build on loans that were already in progress in these 9 countries and to integrate cooling components. So they had a foundation and a relationship and technical expertise in each of these sectors, but they had not previously focused specifically on the importance and potential for adding support for improvements in cooling. So the project approved $157 million for a facility. Facility is one of these words that's been used in different ways in different projects. We could come back to it if there are questions about it. One of the other key issues in climate finance, of course, has been the complaint that a lot of the funding is in the form of loans. And this is, of course, part of this issue that goes back to the Paris Agreement, when the donors, in language that frankly has not been quoted very much, what they promised was to mobilize $100 billion per year, not to give $100 billion a year. But a lot of the discussion I've read in the politics in Glasgow has been around increasing this grant component. In this case, it's a combination that varies from country to country, in which a total of 32 million was given as grant, 125 million as very concessional, that is low interest, very long-term loans, but it does add to country debt and borrowing limits, which is a real concern. And then finally, in terms of the additionality, these are larger projects which collectively are going to involve about $700+ million. So it's a very complex, multi-country, multi-sector approach. But I think one of the most critical outcomes from this is that the World Bank, for the first time, will internally create a cooling community of interest, meaning that cooling and all its challenges, all its technical complexity, will increasingly be a resource of knowledge within the bank that can work across countries and across sectors. A lot of innovation is occurring with respect to cooling. We heard a reference to RMI. Earlier, RMI was a partner with the government of India in developing a global cooling prize. 2 winners were awarded in April of this year, and those products will hopefully reduce the impact of air conditioning on climate change by 5-fold. So that's just one of many possibilities. These are, as I say, simply given to you as an example of some of the challenges in evolving complexity as the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, SIF, and other climate financial entities attempt to come up with more creative and effective solutions to the obvious challenge of funding adaptation. That's End of my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you, Alan, for that interesting presentation. So we'll move now to our fourth speaker, Ben, who will be talking about cost-benefit analysis, and hopefully we'll hear from you about how we can use CBA to both obtain additional resources for climate action, but also to make how we can use this tool to make sure that we're using available resources wisely.
Yeah, so this presentation is a little different than the other ones since I'm not talking about a specific project or facility. I'm just going to talk more broadly about cost-benefit analysis, and it definitely would probably weaved its way through a lot of these projects you've heard. The World Bank and Green Climate Fund definitely use cost-benefit analysis a lot. And the point is really to show how cost-benefit analysis can unlock climate investment, is the title of the presentation is about. So, what the non-economist explanation of cost-benefit analysis, right? What is the cost-benefit analysis? It's a way to sort of compare gray and green projects to understand if the costs of a climate investment will pay off in benefits that are greater than the costs, the upfront costs. It provides justification and rationale for a choice or an investment, and sort of proves that it's the, helps you find the optimal way to sort of move forward on, is it this solar panel we want to do, this, subway system, this wind farm, this agricultural practice, and make sure that you're choosing the best path forward. Next slide. And so in Abt's world, or in the world of climate finance, these are sort of the three ways you can think about, or where cost benefit analyses are often used. The first is justify loans or grants, like sort of in the Green Climate Fund context or the World Bank context. The second, it might be on a project side to demonstrate that a solar plant is feasible, a wind farm is feasible, a subway system will result in emissions reductions. So that's the second place. And the third place we see cost-benefit analysis is in the regulatory space, writing a new climate regulation, writing a new, for whatever the client, a state client, a government actor, an international policy. And so those are the three places. Next slide. So I'm going to walk you through two quick examples of where Abt has used cost-benefit analysis. This first one is in Ghana. This was for a cedar project that was mentioned a few minutes ago. And so in Ghana, sort of like issues with coffee, sometimes they clear cut forests and then they plant coffee farms, opposed to maybe using more sustainable farming practices. And so sort of also like coffee with, where you can use a mixed biodiversity or growing the chocolate in shade. So shade grown cocoa is the ideal way to grow it, and it reduces greenhouse gas emissions from a farming practices. So in this cost benefit analysis, we are trying to figure out what is the most economically optimal way to grow chocolate or cocoa plants which make chocolate. Next slide. And so there was the study and analyzed 9 scenarios and built a tool, a cost benefit tool that local cocoa farmers could actually use to figure out which sustainable farming practice was best for them. Sort of one outcome of this was the net present value, which is, without going into a graduate level economics course, is sort of that measure which you use to determine if the optimal project. Next slide. This was another project Abt had worked on recently. So in 2011, the Obama administration passed the Pipeline Safety Act. This, sort of before methane was trendy, mandated more inspections and more regulation around how pipelines, natural gas transmission pipelines in the United States are maintained and the maintenance around them. So Abt, over the course of 4 or 5 years, worked with the Department of Transportation to develop a cost-benefit analysis of those regulations and sort of find the rationale to justify them. They wanted to know, would the costs on oil and pipeline gas operators outweigh the climate benefits of those regulations? And those regulations were centered around these high consequence area pipelines, sort of the ones that are in cities. So sort of the pipelines that would go right through downtown New York or downtown Washington, D.C. And carry lots of natural gas at high pressures. And the analysis found that, I forget the number, would mitigate about 5,000 to 30,000 metric tons, and that outweighed the cost of the regulation, which was in the millions. So how did this help with climate investment? This helped because it sort of showed that this was a good regulation. The consequences of it were better than the costs. Next slide, please. And so what are other ways you can sort of justify actions, either a project or a regulation or a grant or a loan? And when you're doing these analyses, there's sort of 4 areas which have deep economic literatures that are really important and also can help you sort of get additional benefits to the regulation. These are 4 areas we work with Abt. The first is health code benefits, so avoided mortality and morbidity of a regulation or a project or a facility or whatever the topic is. So that is avoided deaths and avoided avoided injuries. It has a really deep literature. I can tell you the US government values a human life about $10 million. There's a lot of literature out there for other areas, but you could say sort of for every life we save, we're going to value, that's worth a $10 million investment from a climate regulation or a climate policy. There is other economic co-benefits like avoiding poverty, additional income streams, additional, avoided costs. So like if sort of like solar soft costs, like we were talking about before, like streamlining investments or streamlining processes. There is other environmental co-benefits. So if you were improving soil quality or improving water quality, improving air quality, so maybe there's other pollutants. So in addition to reducing CO2, you might be also reducing particulate matter or NOx or methane emissions, as in the context of the natural gas regulation. And then also an area is gender empowerment. So if maybe you're sort of helping equalize the disparities between male and female workers in a workplace. Next slide. And so here is just, the 6 steps we would take to do a cost benefit analysis. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm not going to read through this, but the short bit is here's just a way to think about doing a cost benefit analysis. Feel free to take a picture, or you can go to the next slide. And I guess I thought the next slide was my email, but we can go back. but yeah, I mean, feel free to get a hold of me and I can send this to you if you need it. That's it.
Thank you, Ben. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. And actually, Anaite, I was really intrigued by some of the comments or the information that you shared. One of them, you talked about the Cadmus being a catalyzer for the GDA. So what does that mean? What is the role of a catalyzer and what sort of skills are required to catalyze action?
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you to my fellow panelists for very insightful presentations about important projects that, I think if we take a look into all these presentations, we can find some elements that repeat, and especially for developing countries or vulnerable countries, the issue about data and metrics and market analysis and capacity repeats all along. It's not that we don't have solutions or that we don't know what type of solutions we need to propose to mobilize. And I keep on saying that word, and I'm trying to find a new word. Perhaps after this COP, we can find a new word that is not mobilize, but catalyze. Yeah, I like that word. I think the role that organizations like Cadmus Group, like Abt, like USAID, and the Green Climate Fund, many other important development partners, is bringing that type of expertise, which it's years of experience, and combine it with local knowledge, with innovative solutions, and with partnerships. I think if I can say it in a summary and we can package it together, I think that is a key element to make these investments to unleash the participation of private sector, which is increasingly necessary because we all know that governments alone will not be able to resolve these issues, especially if we want to accelerate, if we want to keep at 1.5 and accelerate adaptation, especially adaptation for developing countries, is a combination of everybody and all hands on deck. So if I don't know if I responded to your question. I think I did. But
Yes, yes. But let me ask something similar to you, Michelle. So, we've been talking about importance of partnerships, of working across sectors. In your case, it was sort of a bank trying to finance programs maybe in agriculture or forestry. So in that particular framework, what is the role maybe of a catalyzer? How can, the development community help spark that conversation between sectors and then, build that into some sort of partnership that eventually leads to investment mobilization?
You're muted, Michelle.
Can we check the audio? We can.
I gave all my insight in the last seconds. That's a great question, and there are many answers to it. One of the ways, so I think what the development community can do, and indeed all of the different funders as well as the practitioners can do, is really do the capacity building that we were just talking about and create awareness. So for example, if you have a national development bank, or if you have a city that wants to issue a green bond and doesn't know how, that's where the development community can come in and can provide that information and that training and really help even ensure that monitoring systems are set up correctly to allow for the tracking of the investments, to make sure that they are accounted for correctly, whether they're ring fenced just to go into certain projects, or whether it's broader than that, and then to help with reporting. And so from the issuer side, the development community can really help get things going, and then it becomes easy, and it is just like another bond. From the investor side, what we found when we were looking into this originally, investors, their first priority was still on ensuring that they received a decent financial return. And again, that's why green bonds are interesting, because they're just like bonds. And they now, with requirements in investment portfolios, there are a lot of investors that are seeking that type of investment. So again, matchmaking is what we can do. We can again provide more information on how do investors find those types of investments. How can they understand the different types of places where they can put in the money? How can we help them match, again, the tenors, the length of time that they have money invested to what they need that for, like insurance companies. So again, it's just a lot of teaching and developing capacity so that it just flows more naturally. And I think that's where we're going. I think it's just starting to flow. The money is there. That's part of what we've been talking about, and how are we unlocking it? And it's through the data that's been talked about here, and the tools to analyze different options, and just to really educate. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So unfortunately, we're running out of time. It has been a really interesting discussion. I think I heard a number of common themes throughout. Obviously, the importance of partnerships and collaboration is key. Data, right? Like most of these tools will be underpinned by data that demonstrate that there's an economic and financial case to invest in a specific climate intervention. And the importance of knowledge and building capacity is also clear. So I just want to thank all of you for being available for this panel. I think there's obviously a lot of questions that we were not able to answer in this limited time, but hopefully we'll continue our discussions and continue engaging through COP26 and beyond. Thanks to all of you.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. And if anybody would like to ask questions later, please do email me. I don't know if our information, our contact information will be provided, but I'm happy to answer questions separately. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Enrique.